Good evening, and welcome back to Quiet Centuries, where histories are told softly for the longest nights. Settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself this evening. Let the lamp grow dim, let the room cool a little around you, and let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders one quiet inch at a time. Have you ever wondered what it might feel like to sit in a slender reed canoe at the first grey light of dawn, and to glide without a single sound across a wide and perfectly still lake, toward a city that seems to rest upon the water itself, its pale towers glowing gold as the sun lifts over the mountains behind it? Tonight we are going to travel, slowly and with no hurry at all, through the whole long life of a people who built exactly such a place, and who called it the finest city that had ever stood upon the earth. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the quiet work I do here, and only if these long nights of history have become a comfort to you. And if you are listening from somewhere far away tonight, do drop your location and your local time down in the comments below, because I always love to read where everyone in our little gathering is settling in to rest. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft and steady hum, draw the covers up, and let us ease gently into tonight's journey together. Long before there was any city on the lake, there was only the water, and the land that cupped it, and the enormous quiet of a high mountain valley that had waited, empty and patient, for a very long time. Picture a broad basin lifted far up toward the sky, so high that the air is thin and clean and cool even under a bright noon sun. Ringed on every side by dark volcanic mountains, whose peaks hold snow through all the seasons of the year. This was the great Central Valley, a bowl of highland set among the clouds, and at its lowest point lay a chain of shallow lakes, 5 of them joined together, their waters spreading silver and pale blue across the floor of the basin, like a single sheet of polished stone laid down among the reeds. The lakes were not deep. In many places a person could wade far out from the shore, with the water rising no higher than the waist, and the bottom was soft with black mud that had gathered there over uncounted ages. Some of the water was sweet, and some of it was faintly salt, for the springs that fed the basin ran down clean from the mountains while the sun drew the moisture up again and left its minerals behind. And so the lakes had their sweeter reaches and their brackish reaches, and those who would one day come to live there learned every one of them by heart. Around the edges grew tall green reeds and rushes, thick beds of them swaying softly whenever the wind came down off the heights, and among the reeds moved herons and ducks and small silver fish, and frogs whose slow evening chorus filled the dusk. The mornings in that valley were a particular thing, worth resting your mind upon for a moment. Mist would lie low over the still lakes at first light, soft and grey, and the 2 great snow mountains that stood guard to the southeast would begin to catch the earliest rose of the sun while the valley floor was still cool and dim. One of those mountains smoked gently from its summit, a thin pale plume drifting always into the morning sky, and those who lived within sight of it gave it a name that meant the smoking mountain, and they thought of it as a living presence, watchful and old. Beside it rose a second peak, white and still and sleeping, and they told one another that these 2 mountains had once been a warrior, and the woman he loved laid down forever in the snow, so that even the shape of the horizon carried a story for those with the patience to look. Into this valley, across the long centuries, people had been coming and going since a time beyond any memory or record. They were farmers, mostly, small and scattered, and they lived by the rhythm of the rain and the maize. They planted their fields when the wet season came rolling up from the lowlands, and they harvested when the skies dried and cleared. And between the planting and the harvest they fished the shallow lakes, and gathered the eggs of water birds, and cut the reeds to weave into mats and baskets in the light hulls of their canoes. They ground their maize upon flat stones. They shaped their houses out of mud and reed and sun-baked brick. They buried those they loved with small offerings of food and pottery, so that the dead would not go hungry on whatever road lay ahead of them. Life moved gently, season by season, guided by the water and by the rain. And they were not the first, not by a very long way. If you could stand at the northern edge of the valley and look across the plain, you would see even then the vast and silent shapes of a city that was already ancient, already abandoned, already half swallowed by grass and time. It was a place of enormous stone pyramids, 2 of them especially, so large that they seemed less like buildings raised by human hands than like natural hills that some giant had squared and smoothed. A wide straight avenue ran between them, longer than a person could walk in comfort, lined with the low ruins of temples and courtyards. And at the far end stood the greatest pyramid of all, broad at its base as a small mountain climbing in wide terraces toward a flat summit open to the sky. Nobody living knew who had built that city, or what tongue those builders had spoken, or by what name they had called themselves. The folk of the valley in those later ages simply looked upon those pyramids with awe, and called the place the dwelling of the gods. For it seemed to them that only gods could have raised such things, and they told one another that this was where the sun and moon had first been made, in the very beginning of the present world. They would walk the long avenue between the mounded temples and feel very small and very young, as one feels standing among ruins that no living voice can explain. That older city had flourished and filled with tens of thousands of people, and had traded and worshipped and painted its walls in brilliant colours, and had then, for reasons lost to us, emptied and fallen quiet, so that by the time our story truly begins, it had already been a ruin for many hundreds of years. There was another memory too, dimmer and more golden, that the valley people carried in their hearts. They spoke of a people they called the Reed Folk, a nation of skilled and gifted craftsmen who had lived to the north of the valley within a great capital of their own, and who had known every art there was to know. These were remembered as the finest of all makers. It was said that their fields had been so blessed that the ears of maize grew as long as a forearm, that their cotton came up from the ground already coloured, that their craftsmen worked feathers and gold and green stone into objects of such beauty that no later hand could equal them, and that their wisest king had been a gentle and learned man who taught his people to look to the sky and to shape the year by the movement of the stars. Whether all of this was truly so, or whether the passing generations had polished the memory brighter than the fact, no one could any longer say. But every people that later rose in the valley wished to be counted as the heirs of those reed folk, and a ruler could claim no finer thing than to trace his blood back to that lost and shining line. So the valley, by the time our wanderers arrive, was a land already thick with the past. It had its ring of mountains and its 2 snow peaks and its smoking summit. It had its wide silver lakes fringed with reed. It had its farmers in their mud brick villages, planting and harvesting by the turn of the year. And it had its ruins and its remembered kingdoms, the abandoned dwelling of the gods to the north and the golden memory of the reed folk beyond that, so that anyone who came new into the basin came as a latecomer into a story that had been unfolding, quietly and without them, for thousands upon thousands of years. The stage, if we may call it that, was very old, and very still, and very beautiful, and it was waiting, though no one in the valley knew it, for one small and unwanted people to arrive footsore out of the north, and to change the shape of everything. Let us rest here for a moment before they come, in that cool, clean air, among the reeds, among the water birds, under the 2 white mountains and the thin plume of smoke, while the mist lies soft upon the lakes and the whole valley breathes slowly in the early light. There is no hurry at all. We have the entire night ahead of us, and the whole long story is going to unfold as gently as the dawn is unfolding now over the still and waiting water. Now let the mist thin a little, and turn your attention to the north, to the dry high country beyond the valley, where the land is harder and the rains less kind. Out of that direction, across many years, came a small band of people walking. They were not many, and they were not grand. They carried what they owned upon their backs and in simple bundles, and they moved as people move who have nowhere settled to go, pausing to plant a little maize where the ground allowed it, staying a season or two, then gathering their bundles again and walking on. They called themselves the Mexica, and in the long memory they kept of their own beginnings they said they had come from an island in the far north, a place of white herons and reeds and caves, and that they had left it behind at the urging of the god who travelled with them. That god was the reason they walked at all. The Mexica carried him with them in the form of a sacred bundle, a wrapped and precious thing borne upon the shoulders of chosen priests, and they believed that his voice came to those priests in dreams and signs, telling them when to stop and when to move, and where their long road would one day end. He was a god of the sun and of war and of the will to endure, and the promise he made to his people was a strange one, for it was not a promise of ease. He did not tell them that their road would be short, or that they would be welcomed, or that the journey would be gentle. He told them, through his priests, that they would wander and suffer and be turned away, and that they should not lose heart, because at the close of all their wandering they would come to a place marked by an unmistakable sign, and there upon that spot and nowhere else, they would raise a city that would become the master of the whole known world. The sign was described to them so that they would know it when at last they saw it. They were to watch for an eagle, a great eagle, perched upon a cactus that grew from a stone amid the waters, and the bird would be resting in the light of the morning sun with its wings spread wide. When they found the eagle on the cactus upon the rock in the water, their walking would be over. Until then, they were to keep faith and keep moving. And so they did for a very long time, longer than the span of a single life, so that children were born on the road who grew old on the road, and grandparents died and were mourned in places whose names their grandchildren would one day forget. Theirs was not an easy passage through the world. Wherever the Mexica came, they came as strangers and as latecomers, into lands already claimed and settled by older and stronger peoples, and they were seldom made welcome. They were poor, they were rough in the eyes of the settled folk, dressed in the skins and coarse cloth of wanderers, rather than the fine woven cotton of the valley towns. They spoke the common tongue of the region, the flowing Nahuatl speech that many nations of the highlands shared, and yet their manners marked them as outsiders, and the rulers of the settled cities looked upon them with suspicion and disdain. Again and again the Mexica would arrive at the border of some prosperous domain and ask leave to stay, and be granted some poor and stony corner that no one else wanted, and there they would linger for a time, labouring and enduring, until at last they wore out the patience of their hosts and were driven onward once more. They served in those years as fighting men for greater lords, for they had grown hard and skilled in the endless walking and the endless want, and a lord who wished to widen his domain could always find use for a band of poor and hungry warriors who asked little and fought well. The Mexica hired themselves out in this way, and they earned a name as fierce and useful soldiers, and yet the very qualities that made them useful made them feared, and the moment a war was won their employers grew as eager to be rid of them as they had been glad of their spears. So the Mexican moved from patron to patron around the shores of the Great Lakes. Always near the water they would one day rule, always looking up at the settled cities on the better ground, always turned out again before they could put down roots. At last they came into the valley of the lakes itself, into that very basin of silver water and reed and snow-topped mountain, and they settled for a while upon a low hill at the western edge of the water, a place of grasshoppers and springs, and from there they looked out across the shallow lakes at the powerful cities that already ringed the shore. But even here they could not remain. They quarrelled with the strongest of the lakeside lords, and they were defeated, and they were driven off their hill and scattered into the marshes. And it seemed for a time that the long promise of their God had led them only to ruin at the very doorstep of the valley. They took refuge among the reeds and mud, on ground so wet and so poor that no established nation had ever wanted it, hiding in the shallows, eating what the water gave them, the fish and the frogs and the insects and the soft roots of the reeds. Wearing garments woven from the fibres of the marsh, waiting, always waiting, for the sign their God had promised. And it was there, in the lowest and least of all the places they had ever come to, upon the wet and unwanted islands in the salt reach of the lake, that the sign was finally given. The story the Mexica told ever afterward, and told to their children and their children's children, was that the priests came at dawn to the edge of a small stony island where a single cactus had taken root, its flat green pads bristling with spines and crowned with hard red fruit, and that upon the topmost pad of that cactus stood an eagle, wide and dark and magnificent, its wings open to the rising sun, holding itself still in the first gold light of the morning above the quiet water. The priests stopped. They looked. They understood. This was the rock amid the waters. This was the cactus upon the rock. This was the eagle perched on its cactus, exactly and in every particular as the God had foretold it through all the long generations of the road. The wandering was over. They had come home to a home they had never before seen. There is something worth pausing over in the fact that the promised place, the place their God had held before them like a distant light through lifetimes of hardship, turned out to be a muddy little island that nobody else on all the shore had wanted. It was not a green and easy paradise. It was a scrap of reed and stone in a shallow salt lake, ringed by the lands of nations far richer and stronger than they. And yet the Mexica did not turn away in disappointment. They saw the sign, and they believed, and they knelt in the wet dawn and gave thanks, and they resolved to make of that unwanted marsh the greatest city the world had ever known. Everything that came after, all the causeways and the temples and the floating gardens and the tribute coming in along the roads, all of it grew out of that one small, stubborn act of faith at the water's edge, when a footsore and unwanted people looked at an eagle in the sunrise and decided that they were, at long last, exactly where they were meant to be. They marked the spot. They gave the island the beginnings of a name that would grow with the city and become known across the whole of that world, and it meant the place of the stone cactus fruit, the place where the cactus grew upon the rock. And on that first morning they raised a small shrine of earth and reed to the god who had brought them, a humble thing, no more than a mound and a little roof of thatch, and around it they began, in the simplest possible way, to live. The night is still young, and the city is not yet built, and there is nothing here at all as yet but reeds and mud and a handful of tired and hopeful people beside a small green cactus. But the sign has been given, and the wandering is done, and from this quiet and unpromising beginning the whole shining story is about to rise, very gradually, out of the water itself. To build a city upon a lake is a strange and patient labour, and the Mexica did it slowly, over many lifetimes, with their hands and their backs and a few simple tools of wood and stone and bone, and no beast of burden to help them and no wheel to turn. They had chosen, or their God had chosen for them, about the least convenient site imaginable, a scatter of low muddy islets in shallow water, and rather than complain of it they set themselves to enlarge it, to bind it together, and to lift it up out of the reach of the flood, until in time the marsh itself became a city of stone that seemed to float upon its own reflection. They began with the reeds and the mud that lay all around them, because that was what they had. Where the water was shallow they drove down long stakes of hard wood into the soft lake bed, packing them close together to make walls that held back the lake, and then they dredged up the black mud from the bottom in baskets and heaped it within those walls until a patch of firm ground rose above the surface. In this way they made new land where there had been only water, a little at a time, one basketful of mud after another, and they joined their small natural islands to these made ones, until the whole grew into a single broad and habitable island large enough to hold a growing town. Out of this same humble practice came one of the loveliest and cleverest things the Mexica ever devised, the floating gardens that fed the city through all its centuries. In the shallow fresh water, at the edges of the island, they laid out long narrow rectangles, staking their borders and weaving mats of reed along the bottom, and into these frames they piled the rich black mud dredged from the lake, layer upon layer, until each plot rose a little above the waterline, a long thin field of astonishing fertility surrounded on every side by canals. They planted willow trees at the corners, and the roots of the willows reached down through the mud and anchored the whole plot fast to the lake bed, so that these garden fields, though they had been raised from the water, did not drift but held their place. The people called them by a name that meant the beds of reeds, and upon them they grew maize and beans and squash and chilies and tomatoes and the amaranth grain and the flowers they loved so dearly. And because the mud was endlessly refreshed from the lake, and the water was always near the roots, These gardens gave crop after crop all through the year without ever wearing out. Between the garden beds ran the canals, and the canals became the streets of the city, for on the island itself there were more waterways than roads, and the people moved about their daily business by canoe far more than on foot. A slender reed or wooden canoe, poled quietly along a narrow channel between the green garden strips, was the ordinary way to carry maize to the market, or reeds to the builder, or a family to a festival. In the cool of the morning the canals filled with these little craft, gliding almost without sound, laden with flowers and vegetables and firewood and fish, and the whole city moved upon the water as naturally as another city moves upon its paved and dusty streets. But an island city cannot live cut off from the shore, and so the Mexica bound their home to the mainland with great causeways, long raised roads of packed earth and stone that ran straight as spear shafts across the open water. There were 3 principal causeways, reaching north and west and south to the lake's edge, each of them broad enough for many people to walk abreast, and each pierced at intervals by wooden bridges that spanned gaps left open for the water to flow through and for the canoes to pass beneath. These gaps served another purpose too, for the bridges could be lifted away, and with the bridges gone, the causeways became broken, and the island became once more an island, sealed off and defended by the water on every side. So the causeways gave the city the best of both conditions, joined to the land for trade and travel, yet able in a moment to become an island fortress that no enemy could easily reach. There was one more problem to solve, and it was the problem of thirst. The lake that surrounded the city was in its nearer reaches brackish and salt, not fit for drinking, and a great city needs an endless flow of sweet water for its people and its gardens and its washing. So the Mexica built an aqueduct, a channel of stone and mortar raised upon a causeway of its own, that carried fresh spring water down from a wooded hill on the lake's western side, where clear springs bubbled cold and clean out of the rock, all the way across the water and into the very middle of the town. The aqueduct was made double, with 2 channels running side by side, so that while one was being cleaned, the other still carried water and the city never went dry. From its mouth in the city the sweet water was drawn off and carried through the streets, and sold in the market and poured into the canals of the garden beds, and the people had good water to drink even as they lived surrounded by a lake they could not touch to their lips. And as the island grew, and the gardens spread, and the causeways reached out and the sweet water flowed in, the city itself began to take on the shape it would keep for as long as it stood. At its centre the Mexica cleared a great open square, a vast paved plaza that could hold a multitude, and around and within that square they raised their most sacred buildings. There, in the very middle of everything, they began the temple that would become the heart of their world. A broad pyramid of stone climbing in stepped terraces toward the sky, crowned at its summit not with 1 shrine but with 2, standing side by side. One for the god who had led them out of the north, and one for the ancient god of rain and water and the growing of the crops. Twin stairways climbed the front of the pyramid, steep and straight, and from the top a person could look out over the whole city and the whole lake and the whole ring of mountains beyond. Around this great temple stood lesser temples, and the dwellings of the priests and the schools, and the round shrine of the wind, and the plaza before it was the meeting place of the entire people. Beyond the sacred centre spread the neighbourhoods where the people lived, each with its own small temple and its own market and its own stretch of garden beds, and each home to a cluster of families who shared descent and craft and custom. The houses of ordinary folk were low and neat, built of sun-baked brick and reed and roofed with thatch, each with its little plot and its canoe tied at the canal's edge, swept clean each morning, for the Mexica were an orderly and a tidy people who bathed often and kept their city clean, sweeping the streets and gathering the refuse and carrying it away by canoe. The homes of the great and the wealthy were larger, built around open courtyards, their rooms opening onto gardens where fountains played and birds sang in cages and rare flowers were tended with care. And over all of it, morning after morning, the sun came up behind the smoking peak and lit the white walls and the painted temples and the green garden plots and the silver water, and the city that had begun as a heap of dredged mud on an unwanted marsh grew more beautiful with every passing year. It is worth remembering, as we rest here and watch the city rising, that all of this was raised without iron, without draft animals, without the wheel, by people carrying baskets of earth and driving stakes into the mud and poling canoes laden with stone across the shallow water. What they had instead of machines was organisation and patience and an enormous shared willingness to labour together toward a thing none of them would live to see completed. The grandparents who fled into the marshes never saw the twin temple finished. The great-grandchildren who walked the finished causeways never knew the taste of the frogs and reeds their ancestors had eaten in the reeds. The city was the work of many generations laid one upon another, mud upon mud, stone upon stone, patient hand after patient hand, until the promise made to a footsore, an unwanted people beside a cactus, had become the fairest island capital the world had ever seen. And still there is a long night ahead, and much more of the story to tell, so let the image of that rising city settle gently in your mind, its white towers doubling in the still lake. As we move on, let us step now off the causeway and into the ordinary life of the city, into the sounds and smells and small doings of a day, for it is in the everyday that the heart of a people is most gently felt. And there is no better place to begin than the market, the vast and orderly market that spread across the northern part of the island in the sister district called Tlatelolco, which had grown up beside the main city and joined itself to it. This was the greatest market in all that world, and travellers who saw it in its glory could scarcely find words for it was a place where tens of thousands of people gathered every single day to buy and sell and barter and marvel, moving in quiet crowds among the endless rows of goods laid out upon mats beneath the open sky. Everything that the land and the water and all the labour of that age could produce was to be found there, each kind of thing in its own appointed section, so that a person always knew where to go. In one quarter lay the food of the fields, the maize in white and yellow and red and blue, the beans of every colour, the squash and the chilies dried and fresh, the tomatoes and the green herbs, the amaranth seed, the sweet potatoes, the mushrooms gathered in the wet season. In another quarter were the birds and the game, the ducks and the turkeys and the small dogs raised for the table, the eggs, the honey of the wild bees, the fish and the frogs and the salamanders, and the strange soft cakes pressed from the algae that grew upon the lake. There were sellers of firewood and charcoal, of reed mats and baskets and cordage, of clay pots and griddles and cups, of knives and blades of black volcanic glass, so sharp they could part a hair. There were healers with their roots and barks and dried herbs laid out in careful rows, each with its known use for fever or wound or sleeplessness or sorrow. Stay a moment longer among the healers, for the care of the sick was an art these people had carried very far, and it opens a gentle window onto their kindness and their patience. Their physicians knew hundreds of plants and their uses, and had gathered this knowledge across generations into a careful living lore, which root to steep for a fever, which bark to bind upon a wound, which leaf to chew for an aching tooth, which blossom to brew into a calming draught for one who could not sleep. They set broken bones with splints and with a paste that hardened as it dried, and they dressed hurts with clean cloth, and with the sap of certain plants that kept a wound from festering, and they understood the steam bath, the small domed house of heat. Not for washing alone, but as a cure, sweating out the aches of the body and easing the pains of the old. Women skilled in the bringing of children attended every birth, wise and long practised, murmuring soft encouragement and grave formal blessings over the mother and the newborn, and the arrival of a child was wrapped about with tender ceremony and with the counsel of the grandmothers. They had remedies for the stomach and the chest, for snake bite and for burns, for grief and for a weariness of the spirit, and though much of their healing was braided together with prayer and with the reading of the sacred days, much of it besides was sound and practical and hard won, the patient fruit of long watching of what helped and what did not. A sick person in that town was never left alone, but was tended by family and by healer, given the proper draughts at the proper hours, kept warm and clean, and fed with gentle foods, and addressed with the same courtesy that ran through all their dealings, so that even in illness a soul was held within the warm net of the household and the neighbourhood. It is a comforting thing to know, as we picture that busy and orderly place, that anyone who fell ill within it fell into caring and knowledgeable hands. There were sellers of finery too, for those who could afford it. There were bolts of woven cotton, plain and dyed and embroidered, and cloaks worked in patterns that showed a man's rank at a glance. There were feathers, the glory of that world, feathers of every hue traded up from the hot lowlands and the distant forests, the scarlet of the macaw, the pink of the spoonbill, and above all the long shimmering, long green tail feathers of that most sacred bird, so precious that only the greatest lords might wear them. There was worked gold, thin and bright, hammered and cast into ornaments and beads and little bells. There was green stone, the jade they prized above gold, carved into beads and figures and earplugs. There was amber and rock crystal and shell and turquoise set in patient mosaic. There were also the cacao beans, the beans of the chocolate tree, which were more than a food in that market, for they served the people as money. This is a thing worth dwelling upon, gently, for it tells you much about the calm good sense of these people. They had no coins of metal, no stamped money of the kind that other nations used, and yet they carried on the largest trade in their world with perfect ease, because they had agreed together upon a few common things that would stand for value. Small purchases were counted in cacao beans, a handful of which would buy a day's simple needs, and larger ones in lengths of woven cotton cloth, and the greatest transactions in quills filled with gold dust. A person might buy a canoe or a turkey or a load of firewood and settle the price in beans counted out into the palm, and everyone knew the going rate. And the whole enormous exchange went forward honestly and quietly under the open sky. And it did go forward honestly, for the market was governed. Judges sat in a raised house at the edge of the great square, watching over the trade, and if a dispute arose, or a seller was found to cheat with false measure or spoiled goods, the matter was brought before them and settled on the spot, and the cheat was punished then and there. Officers walked among the mats to see that all was orderly, that each seller kept to the proper section, that prices were fair and measures true. So the greatest gathering of people in that world went about its daily business without tumult. A vast, slow river of buyers and sellers flowing among the goods, the air full of the low murmur of bargaining and the smell of cooking and flowers and cut herbs. The whole thing dissolving each evening as the crowds went home by canoe across the darkening water, and gathering again with the next day's dawn. Away from the market, the days of the common people turned upon simple and steady labour, and upon the deep rhythms of the family and the household. A man rose before dawn and went out to his garden beds, poling his canoe through the cool mist to tend the maize and the beans, or he took up his trade if he was a craftsman, the potter to his clay, the weaver to her loom, the feather worker to his patient art, the stone cutter to his block. A woman rose earlier still, and kindled the fire, and set to the long daily task of the maize, soaking and grinding the kernels upon the flat stone, patting out the flat round cakes, and cooking them upon the clay griddle, so that the smell of the cooking maize drifted through every neighbourhood of the city with the first light, and became the very smell of morning itself. Children were set young to useful work and to careful teaching, the boys following their fathers, the girls their mothers, learning the crafts, the manners, and the countless small skills by which a household kept itself. The people of the city loved order and cleanliness and courtesy, and these things ran deep in their manners. They bathed daily, and the great and the wealthy took steam baths in little domed houses of stone heated with fire, sweating and then washing in cool water. They dressed simply but with care, the men in a loincloth and a cloak knotted at the shoulder, the women in a long skirt and a loose embroidered blouse. The fineness of the cloth and the richness of the dye and the pattern all speaking of rank and means. They spoke to one another with an elaborate and gentle courtesy, full of respectful forms and soft turns of phrase, for good speech was prized among them as a mark of a good upbringing. And a person who spoke well and kindly and modestly was admired above one who was merely rich. And they loved flowers. Perhaps above all things they loved flowers, and this too tells you much about them. They grew flowers in their garden beds, and in pots upon their roofs, and in the courtyards of the great houses. They carried bunches of flowers to the market and to the temple and to their feasts. A guest at a banquet would be given flowers to hold and to smell. Poets sang of flowers as the truest image of all that was beautiful and brief in life, and the lords kept whole gardens of rare blooms brought from far away, tended by skilled gardeners, laid out beside pools and fountains for no purpose at all but delight. In a world that could be hard, and often was, This tenderness towards small and fragile and lovely things ran like a bright thread through everything the people did, and it is a good thing to hold in mind as we picture them. This vast and disciplined and orderly nation that nonetheless stopped every day to fill its hands with flowers. So passed the ordinary days in the town among the reeds, in labour and trade and family and courtesy, and the quiet love of beautiful things, the canoes gliding on the canals at dawn, the smell of cooking maize, the great market filling and emptying, the flowers on the roofs and the water lying still and silver all around. There is no drama in such a day, and that is exactly its comfort. Rest here a while in the gentle round of it before we drift out upon the living lake that cradled the whole of the town. Let us stay a little longer among the ordinary comforts of that age, and turn our attention from the market to the lake itself. For the lake was the mother of the whole city, and the daily round of the common folk was bound up with its shallow silver reaches in 100 gentle ways. To live upon an island in a lake is to live half upon the water, and the people did so gladly. And much of their food and their labour and their quiet pleasure came up out of the shallows around their homes. They fished the lake with nets and with wicker traps, and with fine 3-pronged spears, gliding out at first light among the reeds where the water was clear and cool. And they brought home small silver fish in great numbers, to be eaten fresh or dried in the sun for the leaner seasons. They gathered the eggs of the countless water birds that nested in the reed beds, and they snared the ducks that came down in their vast flocks upon the water, spreading nets between poles at dusk and driving the birds into them. They took frogs and salamanders and the small shrimp of the shallows, and they even skimmed from the top of the water a soft blue-green growth, a kind of scum that gathered thick in certain reaches, which they pressed into cakes and dried and ate, and which was nourishing and much valued, so that nothing the water offered was wasted. And there was the salt. In the brackish eastern reaches, where the water lay warm and shallow and heavy with minerals, the salt makers worked their patient trade, leading the salt water into shallow beds and letting the strong sun draw the water up into the air day after day, until only the white salt was left glittering upon the ground to be gathered and shaped into cakes and carried to the market. Salt was precious for its seasons and preserves, and the salt beds at the lake's edge were worked from long before the city rose until long after it fell. Above all there were the canoes, for the canoe was to that world what the cart and the road are to others, and the lake and its canals were crowded with them from dawn to dusk. They were cut and shaped from single logs, or built up light from reed, narrow and swift and silent, poled along by a standing figure with a single long pole, and in them the people carried everything, the maize and the flowers to market, the stone and the timber to the builders, the family to the feast, the dead to their burial, the sweet water to the thirsty streets. A whole life could be lived upon the water, and much of it was, and on a still evening the canals would fill with canoes going home in the last gold light, laden and quiet, their poles dipping and rising without a sound, their wakes spreading and crossing and smoothing away again upon the darkening water. There is a great peace in that picture of the living lake, in the fissure among the reeds at dawn, and the salt drying white under a strong sun, and the laden canoes gliding home at dusk, and it is a peace the people themselves must have felt, for all their warring and their tribute and their solemn faith. when they went out in the cool morning upon the quiet water to gather what the lake had freely given. Hold that gentle water world in your mind now, silver and still and generous, before we go on to look at how these same people played and sang and kept their feasts. A people is known not only by its labour and its faith, but by its play, by what it does in the hours it keeps for delight. And this nation, for all its gravity, loved to play and to sing and to dance and to gather in great numbers for the sheer joy of a festival. So let us spend a soft hour among their pleasures, for there is nothing more soothing than to picture a whole people at ease. They had a great ball game, ancient and half sacred, played in a long stone court shaped like a capital letter laid upon its side, with sloping walls down the two sides and a narrow alley between. In this court 2 teams would drive a heavy ball of solid rubber back and forth, striking it not with the hands or the feet, but with the hip and the thigh and the forearm, so that the game demanded great skill and toughness, the players padded at the hip and the knee against the hard-bounding ball. High upon the side walls, in the grander courts, were set stone rings, and to send the ball through one of these rings was so rare and so difficult a feat that it might end the game at a stroke. The game was watched by great crowds and wagered upon heavily, and it carried besides a deep meaning, for the people saw in the bounding of the ball across the court an image of the movement of the sun and stars across the sky, so that even their sport was woven into the great order of the heavens. They had gentler games too, games of chance played upon a cross-shaped board with beans for dice, over which friends would sit for hours in the shade, laughing and wagering small stakes of cacao beans or feathers or cloaks. And they had their music everywhere, for no feast and no ceremony went without it, though it was music of a kind we would find strange, having no strings at all, but built upon the drum and the rattle and the flute and the shell trumpet and the whistle. There were great upright drums of hollowed wood covered with skin, and there were flat wooden drums carved with a slotted tongue that gave 2 deep notes when struck. And the deep pulse of these drums carrying across the water at night, calling the people to a festival, was one of the great sounds of that world. And there was dancing. Above all there was dancing. For at the festivals the people danced in their hundreds and their thousands, in long winding lines and in great turning circles, holding hands or linking arms, the dancers dressed in flowers and feathers and their finest cloaks, moving together to the drums for hour upon hour through the day and into the torchlit night. To dance well and to know the songs was a part of a good upbringing, taught in the schools alongside their crafts and their councils, and a great festival dance, with the whole community turning together in bright array to the pulse of the drums under the open sky, was among the deepest joys the people knew, a thing that bound them together and lifted them out of the labour of their days. So they played their sacred game, and cast their beans upon the board in the shade, and beat their deep drums across the evening water, and danced in their flowered thousands through the festival nights. And in all of this the same people who counted the days so gravely and served their sun so faithfully showed the other side of their nature, the joyful and the playful and the warm. Let the deep pulse of those drums fade softly now across the darkening lake, and the long lines of dancers grow still, as we turn to the patient art by which this nation marked out its days and its years. Among all the things these people made, none was more patient or more beautiful than their manner of measuring time, for they were great counters of days, and the turning of the seasons was to them a sacred and intricate thing. They kept not one calendar but two, running side by side at once, each with its own purpose, the two of them wheeling together like two toothed rings of different sizes. And the counting of the days governed nearly everything they did, when to plant and when to harvest, when to hold a festival, when a child should be named, when a journey should begin, and which days were fortunate and which were best spent quietly at home. The first of these calendars was the count of the seasons, the solar year, and it ran to 365 days, just as our own year does, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, which makes 360, with a small remainder of 5 days left over at the end. Those 5 last days were held to be unlucky and empty, days that belonged to no month. And during them the people did as little as they could, lit no new fires, began no new work, and waited quietly for the year to turn. Each of the 18 months had its own name and its own great festival, tied to the round of the farming year and to the honouring of the many gods, so that the whole solar calendar was a long slow procession of ceremonies, one flowing into the next, marking the rains and the dry season, the planting and the ripening and the gathering of the maize. The second calendar was stranger to our way of thinking, and older and more sacred still, and it ran to 260 days. It was made by combining a cycle of 13 numbers with a cycle of 20 named signs. The signs of things like the reed and the flint knife, and the rain and the flower and the eagle and the leaping deer, and as the numbers and the signs turned together each day, received a unique name, a number joined to a sign, and no day name repeated until all these day names had passed, and the great wheel came round again to its start. This was the calendar of destinies, the count that the priests studied to read the fortune of things, and above all to read the fortune of a newborn child. For the day on which a person was born was believed to shape the whole course of that person's life, and a child born under a strong and fortunate sign was thought blessed, while one born under a dark sign might have its naming delayed by the priests to a better day nearby, so as to soften the luck it had been given. The two calendars, the count of 365 days and the count of the sacred days, turned together year upon year, and only once in a very long while did a given day in the one calendar meet again the same day in the other. That meeting came round once every 52 years, and the completing of those 52 years was the greatest reckoning of time the people knew. A full cycle, a bundle of years, the nearest thing they had to a century. As the end of such a cycle drew near, a solemn dread settled over the whole land, for the people believed that the world itself might end at the close of a bundle of years if the gods so willed it, that the sun might fail to rise, and the age might be extinguished as earlier ages were believed to have been extinguished before it. And so, on the last night of the 52 years, they let every fire in every hearth and temple go dark, and cast out their old pots and mats, and sat in the blackness and the silence, and waited to see whether the world would continue. The priests climbed to a high place outside the city, and watched the night sky, watched a certain cluster of stars. And when at the middle of the night those stars crossed the highest point of the heavens and moved on, it was taken as the sign that their world had been granted another bundle of years, and a great fire was kindled anew. And from that single new flame fire was carried down to the city, and out along the causeways to every temple and every hearth in all the land, so that by dawn the whole valley was alight again with new fire, and the people wept and rejoiced and set about making everything new. It is a moving thing to picture, the whole nation sitting in darkness through one long night every 52 years, uncertain whether the sun would return, and then the single new fire spreading out across the water in the dark, from temple to temple and house to house, and the relief of the morning. It shows how seriously they took the turning of time, and how deeply they felt that the order of the heavens was not owed to them but given, and might be given again, or might not. To keep all this counting, and to keep the memory of their kings and their battles and their tribute and their gods, the people made books. They did not write with letters as we do, but they painted, in bright and careful pictures and signs upon long strips of bark paper and deer hide, folded like a screen, so that a book opened out into one long painted band that could be read panel by panel. In these painted books the priests and the trained scribes set down the calendars and the fortunes of the days, the histories of the ruling houses, the maps of the land, the records of what each conquered town owed in tribute, and the great cycles of ceremony. The making and the reading of these books was a learned art kept by a class of educated men, and a well-made book was a treasure. Its colours brilliant, its signs precise, its knowledge the accumulated wisdom of generations. And because such knowledge had to be passed on, the people built schools, and here they did something that few nations of their time or any time have done, for they sent very nearly all their children to be schooled, the sons of lords and the sons of common folk alike. There were schools of two kinds. In the one, attached to the temples, the sons of the noble houses were given a hard and holy education, taught the painted books and the counting of the days and the songs and the histories and the service of the gods, disciplined severely, made to rise in the night for prayer and to fast and to learn self-mastery, and prepared for the priesthood or for the highest offices of rule. In the other, spread through every neighbourhood, the ordinary boys were taught the crafts and the duties of a citizen, the use of arms for the defence of the city, the songs and the dances of the festivals, the history of their people, and above all the code of conduct, the long tradition of upright and modest and courageous living that the people held before their young as the very picture of a good life. For the girls there was teaching too, mostly within the household and at the hands of their mothers and grandmothers, in the arts of the home and the loom and the kitchen and the raising of children, though some girls were given for a time to the service of the temples, to sweep the sacred courts and tend the sacred fires and weave the cloth for the gods, before returning to marry and keep households of their own. And running through all of this teaching, for boys and girls alike, for noble and common alike, was that same insistence on courtesy and self-control and reverence and modest speech, drilled into the young by long-recited counsels, the gathered advice of the elders, so that a child grew up hearing, over and over in beautiful and formal words, how a good person carries himself in the world, how he speaks, how he eats, how he honours his elders and cares for his family, and endures misfortune without complaint. So the people counted their days and kept their year and painted their books and schooled their children, and through all these patient arts they bound the generations together and carried their knowledge forward across time. There is a great calm in a people so ordered so mindful of the wheeling of the heavens, so careful to hand down what they knew. Let that calm settle over you now, the slow wheeling of the two calendars, the new fire spreading in the dark, the children reciting the counsels of the elders in the school courts at dawn, and in a little while we will turn to the kings, under whom the city grew from a town upon the marsh into the master of the valley. In the earliest days upon the island, when the city was still small and poor, the Mexica had no king of their own, but were ruled by their elders and their priests, and they lived under the shadow of a far greater power. For the strongest nation in the valley at that time was a people whose capital stood across the water westward, a rich and warlike city that had spread its rule over most of the lakeside towns and gathered tribute from all of them. The little island city, hemmed in and weak, became a subject and a servant of that western power, and paid it tribute, and sent its young men to fight in its wars, and bought its right to exist upon the marsh with obedience and with the labour of its hands. Yet even a subject city may wish for a king of its own, and the Mexica, looking about them at the grander nations, felt keenly that they had no royal line, no blood that reached back to the golden reed folk of the old days, and that this lack made them small in the eyes of their neighbours. So they did a wise and humble thing. They went to a neighbouring city whose ruling house did carry that ancient and honoured blood, and they asked that a young prince of that house be given to them to be their first true king, so that their own line of kings might begin with the noblest descent the valley could offer. The prince was given, and the Mexica raised him up as their first lord, and his name was Acamapictli, and from him descended all the kings who came after, so that the humble island people now had a royal house rooted in the oldest and most revered lineage of the land. Acamapictli ruled long and wisely, and under him the city grew, its canals were widened, its garden beds multiplied, its temples were rebuilt in stone, and its people increased. He took wives from many of the noble families of the neighbourhood, and his many children married into the great houses of the city, and so the royal blood was woven through the whole of the rising nobility. After him his son ruled, and after his son another of the line, each adding to the city, each strengthening it. And yet through all their reigns the island remained a subject still, bound to serve the great power upon the western margin, its growing strength held in check by the tribute it was forced to pay, and the deference it was forced to show. The turning came in the reign of the king remembered as Itzcoatl, whose name meant the obsidian serpent, and who was a son of the founding king by a common woman of the market rather than a noble wife, a man of no high birth on his mother's side, who rose none the less to be the maker of his people's greatness. In his time the old power on the shore to the west fell into a bitter quarrel over its own succession, and its harsh new ruler pressed the island city hard, demanding ever more tribute and treating the Mexica with open contempt, until it seemed that the little nation must either bow entirely or be destroyed. Many among the Mexica, frightened, counselled surrender, and wished to carry their God out to the western lord and beg for mercy. But there was another voice among them, and it was the voice that changed their history. That voice belonged to a royal counsellor named Tlacaelel, a nephew of the king, a man of piercing mind and iron will who never took the throne himself, but who stood beside the throne through the reigns of several kings and shaped the destiny of his people more than any crowned lord ever did. Tlacaelel argued against surrender. He proposed instead a bargain between the people and their king, a solemn compact, that the king and the nobles would lead the people to war against the Western power, and if they were beaten the people might do with their lords as they wished, but if they won, then the people would serve their lords faithfully forever after. The bargain was struck. The Mexica went to war against the masters they had served so long, and they did not go alone, for they made common cause with another aggrieved lake city, the city of Texcoco on the lake's eastern side, whose own prince had been driven from his throne and longed to win it back. Against all likelihood, the alliance won. The great power along the western edge was thrown down, its proud capital taken, and its rule broken. And the island city that had been a servant for so many generations stood suddenly free, and more than free, victorious. Out of that victory came the arrangement that would order the valley for the rest of its history. A league of 3 cities, a triple alliance. The island city of the Mexica was one. The city of Texcoco across the water eastward, ruled now by the prince it had helped restore, was the second, and a smaller western city was admitted as the third and lesser partner. These 3 would share the spoils of war and the tribute of conquered towns, 2 greater portions and 1 lesser, and would march together against their enemies, and among them the island city, though it began as an equal of Texcoco, would steadily grow to be the first and the greatest, until the alliance became in truth the empire of the Mexica, with 2 honoured partners at its side. Tlacaelel did more than win the war, for he understood that a people who mean to rule must believe themselves born to rule, and he set about remaking the very memory and faith of his nation to fit its new greatness. It is said that after the victory he had the old painted books gathered up and burned, the books that told of the Mexica as a poor and wandering and despised people, and that he caused new histories to be painted in their place, histories in which the Mexica were a chosen nation, descended from the ancient and noble line, appointed by their God to feed the sun and to rule the earth. He lifted their God to the highest place among the gods, and taught that it was the sacred duty of the Mexica above all peoples to sustain the sun in its daily journey and to hold back the darkness, and that their wars and their conquests were not mere greed, but a holy service upon which the very life of the world depended. Whether this was cynical statecraft or true devotion, or both at once, it welded the people into a nation certain of its purpose, and that certainty carried them very far. Under Itzcoatl and his successors, guided always by the long counsel of Tlacaelel, the water-ringed city rose with astonishing speed from the first among 3 lake cities to the mistress of a widening empire. Army after army marched out along the causeways and the roads, into the valleys beyond the mountains, down toward the hot lowlands and the 2 distant seas, and town after town was brought under the alliance, not usually settled or occupied, but left in place under its own lords, and bound to send tribute. So many loads of cotton cloth, so many baskets of cacao, so many bundles of feathers, so much maize and gold and jade, carried back along the roads to the island city upon appointed days. The city swelled with this wealth. Its temples were rebuilt higher and grander, the great twin pyramid at the centre raised up layer upon layer until it towered over the whole basin, its palaces enlarged, its markets glutted with the goods of 100 conquered lands, its population grown into the hundreds of thousands, until it was, by any measure of that world, the largest and richest city that had ever stood beneath those mountains. And so the promise made so long ago beside the cactus was fulfilled, and more than fulfilled, in the space of only a few reigns, and the footsore wanderers who had hidden in the reeds became the masters of the valley and the gatherers of its tribute. It happened as such things do. Through a mixture of faith and cunning and courage and sheer relentless will, through the humble asking for a king, and the bold bargain before the war, and the burning of the old books and the writing of the new, and the patient binding of town after town into the net of tribute. Rest now on the height of that achieved greatness, the empire spreading, the tribute borne inward along the roads, the twin temple rising over the shining city, and presently we shall turn from war and empire to something gentler, to a king who was also a poet, and to the songs he made about flowers and the shortness of our days. Across the water from the island city, upon the eastern margin of the lake, stood the allied city of Texcoco, and Texcoco in those years was the fairest and most learned place in all the valley, a city of gardens and libraries and law, and it was ruled by a man whom later ages would remember not chiefly as a warrior or a conqueror, though he was both, but as a poet, a builder, a lawgiver, and a seeker after some single hidden source of all things. His name was Nezahualcoyotl, which meant the fasting coyote, and his long life spanned much of the century in which the empire rose. And of all the many lords of that world, he is the one whose inner voice still reaches us, because he made songs, and the songs were remembered and written down, and in them a living heart still speaks softly across the centuries. His beginnings were bitter. He was a prince of Texcoco, and while he was still a boy, the great western power that then ruled the valley made war upon his father the king and threw down his city. And the boy watched from the branches of a tree, hidden in the leaves, as his father was hunted down and killed. He became a fugitive, a prince without a throne, hunted through the mountains, sheltered by loyal servants, and by strangers who risked their lives for him, hiding in caves and in the houses of the poor, growing to manhood as a wanderer with a price upon his head. It was in those hard years, most likely, that he earned or was given his strange name, the fasting coyote, the lean and solitary creature that endures. And it was those same years, one feels, that taught him the two things his songs would return to ever after: the sweetness of a life that can be taken away in a single morning, and the longing for something behind the many gods that would not fade and could not be thrown down. When at last the alliance was made and the old power broken, Nezahualcoyotl won back the throne of his fathers, and he ruled Texcoco for a long reign of peace and greatness, and he poured all his gifts into the making of a just and beautiful city. He gave his people a famous code of law, clear and firm and evenly applied, so that Texcoco became known for its justice, its judges honest, its courts open, its punishments known beforehand and fairly given. He built palaces and temples and pleasure gardens, and above all he made, on a wooded hill a little way from the city, a retreat of astonishing loveliness, with terraces cut into the slope, and pools and baths hewn from the living rock, and channels that carried water along the hillside to feed fountains and to water groves of rare trees gathered from every corner of the land. There he would withdraw from the business of rule to walk among the trees and the running water, and to think and to make his songs. And he was, it is said, a builder of the island city too. For when the great lake threatened in flood to drown the low streets of his ally across the water, it was Nezahualcoyotl who designed the remedy, a vast dike of stone and earth and timber, many miles in length, run out across the open lake to hold back the salt and brackish flood of the eastern reaches and to keep the water around the city sweet and calm. The building of that dike was one of the wonders of the age, a wall raised in the middle of a lake by the labour of a whole people, and it stood for generations and saved the city more than once from the rising water. So the poet was also an engineer, and the dreamer was also a most practical friend to his allies, and in him the two sides of that world, the tender and the mighty, were joined in a single long and fruitful life. Yet it is for the songs that we remember him, and it is right that we should, for they carry a mood that suits this quiet hour better than any account of dikes and laws. That whole nation loved poetry as they loved flowers, and indeed they used the same breath for both, for they called their poetry by a double name that meant flower and song, as though a poem were a blossom made of words, beautiful and fragrant and doomed to fade. They gathered at the feasts of the lords to hear the singers, and the greatest among the lords were themselves singers. And Nezahualcoyotl was reckoned the greatest of all. His songs did not boast of conquest or riches. They dwelt, again and again, gently and without fear, upon the shortness of our stay upon the earth, and upon the beauty that shines all the brighter, because it cannot last, and upon a quiet hope that somewhere beyond the fading there was a giver of life who did not fade. He would sing of the flowers of the earth as a mirror of our days, and one such song, rendered softly into our own speech, ran something like this. I, the singer, gather flowers to make a garland for a short season, for the flowers are lent to us and not given, and soon they must be set aside. We come to the earth only to borrow its blossoms, only to borrow its songs, and then we go, and the flowers we held pass into other hands. He returned often to that thought, that we do not own the beauty we are lent, but we hold it briefly and pass it on, and there is no bitterness in the songs, only a clear and tender acceptance, the acceptance of a man who had lost much early, and had learned to love what remained without clutching at it. He asked, as thoughtful people in every age have asked, whether anything of us endures, and he framed the question in images drawn from the treasures his people prized, the jade and the gold and the bright feathers of the sacred plumed bird. Another of his songs may be given, quietly, in this form. Not forever on the earth, only a short season here. Though it be jade it shatters, though it be gold it wears away, though it be the plume of the holy plumed bird it tears and is lost. Not forever on the earth, but a brief span here. He looked upon the most lasting and precious things his world knew, the green stone and the beaten gold and the shimmering plume, and he saw that even these break and wear and scatter, and he did not despair at it, but let the knowledge make each passing day more dear. And yet he was not without hope, and in his deepest songs he reached past all the many gods of his people, past the idols of wood and stone, toward a single unseen source of life, whom he called by names that meant the giver of life, the one by whom we live, the Lord of the near and the close, the night and the wind. He built, it is remembered, a high tower to this hidden god, and set within it no image at all, for he had come to feel that the true maker of things could not be shaped by any hand or seen by any eye. One of his songs of that longing may be softly rendered so. Where shall I go? Where is the road to the giver of life? Are you real? Are you rooted, you by whom all things live? Only here, in the flowers, in the songs, do I seem to touch you, and even the flowers, even the songs must fade. Let me not go alone into the silence. Let me carry a garland with me on the road. There is in such a song a peace very fitting to the hour of sleep, the peace of a man who has looked steadily at the shortness of everything, and has answered it not with fear, but with flowers. Nezahualcoyotl lived to a great age, honoured throughout the valley as the wisest of its lords, and he died in his own city, in his own bed, an old man surrounded by his people, having given them law and beauty and song, and having befriended and helped to build the island city that would one day, long after his death, be swept away. His memory was kept green for as long as that world lasted, and his songs were sung at the feasts, and they were among the things the later scribes took care to write down, and so, almost alone among all the countless human hearts that beat and were stilled in that great civilization, his heart still speaks to us, saying softly that we linger here only a passing hour, that the jade shatters and the plume is torn, and that we should gather our flowers gently while the light lasts. Rest a moment in the company of that gentle king, among his terraces and running water and borrowed blossoms, and by we will climb, quietly and without alarm, to look at the great temple that crowned the sacred precinct, and at the faith the nation kept there. At the very core of the island city, in the great walled precinct that was its beating heart, rose the temple that the people held most sacred, the tall stepped pyramid crowned with its two shrines side by side. To understand that whole nation at all, we must understand, calmly and without judgment, what they believed took place there, and why it mattered so much to them. For their faith was not a small thing set apart from their lives, but the very frame on which their whole world was built, and to them the ceremonies of the temple were nothing less than the labour by which the sun was kept rising, and the rain kept falling, and the world kept turning through another day. They believed that the world had been made and unmade many times before their own age. They told of earlier suns, earlier ages of the world, each ruled by a different power, each ending in ruin, one swept away by water, one by wind, one by fire, one by beasts, so that the present age, the age of the fifth sun, under which they lived, was only the latest in a long series, and was itself destined one day to end. And they believed that the present sun, the sun that rose each morning over the smoking mountain and crossed the sky and sank again, moved and lived only because the gods themselves, at the beginning of this age, had given their own life and blood to set it in motion. In their sacred story, the gods had gathered in the darkness at the ruined city of the old pyramids to the north, and there one humble god had cast himself into a great fire and risen as the sun, and the other gods had given themselves likewise, so that the new sun would have the strength to move. The world, in their eyes, had been bought at the price of the gods' own lives, and it was held in being only by a constant return of life and gratitude from those who lived upon it. From this belief flowed the whole of their worship. If the gods had given their life to make the sun, then the people must give something in return to keep it moving, and the greatest gift they could conceive was life itself, offered back to the powers that had first given it. And so, at the temples, the priests made offerings, and among those offerings, at the great festivals, were human lives, most often the lives of captives taken in war. This is the hardest thing about that world for us to look upon, and we will look upon it only briefly and only from a distance, as one glimpses a solemn thing through a doorway and passes on, for it would not be right to dwell upon it, and it is not the purpose of this quiet night to do so. Let it be enough to understand that the people did not see this as cruelty, but as duty, even as sacrifice in the truest sense, a giving of the most precious thing to sustain the world for everyone, and that many even of those who were offered were held to share in that belief. It was, to them, the price of the dawn. Set that solemn matter gently aside now, and consider instead the gentler faces of their faith, for their world was crowded with gods, and most of the ceremonies of the year had nothing to do with war, and everything to do with the growing of the crops, the coming of the rain, the ripening of the maize, the honouring of the hearth and the household. They loved and feared above all the old god of the rain, who lived, they said, upon the mountain tops among the clouds, and who sent the life-giving water down upon the fields, and to him they prayed with a tenderness and an anxiety that any farmer in any age would know, for the rain was life, and its failure was famine. Their prayers to him were beautiful, humble, and full of feeling, and one such prayer, softly rendered, went in this manner: Lord of the green places, Lord of the standing waters, the maize is thirsting in the field, the little plants lift up their leaves to you, the people are watching the sky. Send down your rain, we beg you, upon the young and tender shoots. Let the children not go hungry. We are only your people, only your poor ones, waiting beneath the clouds. There is nothing in such a prayer that a heart of any faith could not recognize, only the ancient human asking of the sky for mercy and for bread. They honoured a great many other powers besides. There was the feathered serpent, the gentlest of their gods, a god of wind and learning, and the morning star and the arts of peace, who was said to have taught the old reed folk all their crafts, and who was remembered as having hated the giving of lives, and asked only for flowers and butterflies, and the incense of burning gum. There was the mother goddess of the earth, from whom all things came, and to whom all things returned. There was the Lord of the night and the wind, unseen and everywhere, whom the wisest, like the poet king across the water, reached toward as something almost single and almost supreme. There were also the small household gods, the god of the hearth fire, the spirits of the young grain, the protectors of merchants and of craftsmen and of women in childbirth, each with its little rites, so that the sacred was woven through every hour of ordinary life, in the offering of a few drops before a meal, in the incense burned at dawn, in the flowers laid before a household shrine. Their priests were many, and their training was long and severe. From boyhood the temple students rose in the cold and the dark to sweep the sacred courts, and to feed the sacred fires that were never allowed to go out, to fast and to keep vigil, and to learn the endless calendar of ceremonies, the songs, the prayers, the meanings of the days. The high priests were among the most powerful men of the nation, honoured beside the king himself, and the ordinary people took part in the round of festivals with their whole hearts. For the ceremonies were also their music and their theatre, and their dancing and their feasting, the bright punctuation of the labouring year, when the whole city put on flowers and gathered in the great square to sing and to dance in long winding lines to the sound of the drums and the flutes and the shell. Trumpets, and to eat the special foods of the season, and to feel themselves one people under one sky. And woven through all their religion was a strain of deep moral teaching, handed down in the long recited gathered wisdom of the old, the gathered wisdom that parents spoke to their children and rulers to their people. And these counsels, when we read them now, are full of a grave and gentle beauty. A father would say to his son something rendered softly like this: "Here on the earth we travel a difficult road, a narrow ridge with a steep fall on either hand. So walk with care, my child. Do not give yourself to pride, for pride is a rot in the heart. Do not mock the old, or the sick, or the one who has stumbled, for you do not know what the days will bring to you. Speak quietly. Work steadily. Honour those who gave you life. Be a face and a heart that others may trust." Such words were spoken to the young of that world over and over, in beautiful and formal phrases, and they show us that beneath the strangeness of their son and their offerings the people held to virtues we would know at once: humility, kindness, honesty, endurance, and reverence for those who came before. So the great temple stood at the core of the town, and the two shrines looked out over the still lake, and the fires burned, and the incense rose, and the festivals turned with the seasons, and the people gave to their gods what they believed the world required of them, and asked in return for rain and maize and children and the daily rising of the sun. We need not share their faith, nor close our eyes to its hard edge, to feel the awe of a whole nation so certain that the ordinary miracle of the morning depended upon their care and their devotion, so mindful that the world was a gift and a debt, and not a thing to be taken for granted. Let that awe rest quietly with you now, the incense rising in the cold dawn, the flowers heaped before the shrines, the words of the elders murmured to the children, and after a slow breath we shall look upon the empire at the very height of its golden noon, under its last and most famous lords. Before we climb toward the empire at its height, let us pause among two kinds of people who gave that world much of its colour and its glory: the warriors who defended it and widened it, and the craftsmen whose patient hands made it beautiful. For in these two callings, the fierce and the gentle, something essential about the whole nation may be gently understood. The men who fought were not a separate caste set apart from birth, as warriors were in some lands, but ordinary young men raised up by courage and by deed. Every boy, whether the son of a lord or of a market gardener, was trained from childhood in the handling of arms, and every young man was expected to go out with the armies when his season came, and to prove himself in the field, for war was held to be a sacred labour as much as a matter of land and tribute, a service owed to the sun. And the surest way for a young man of humble birth to rise in that society, to win fine cloaks and a house, and the right to be heard in council, was to distinguish himself in battle, and above all to take captives with his own hands. For a warrior was measured not by how many he struck down, but by how many he brought back alive. Out of this rose the famous warrior orders, the companies of proven fighters, into which a man was admitted once he had taken his captives and shown his valour, and chief among them were two that every child of that world knew and longed to join. There were the eagle warriors, who dressed for battle in suits worked to resemble the great bird, with a helmet fashioned as an eagle's open beak, from which the warrior's face looked out, and feathers running down the arms like wings, so that a company of them moving into the field seemed a flight of enormous birds come down to earth. And there were the jaguar warriors, who wore the spotted skin of the great forest cat, its head drawn over their own as a helmet, its pelt covering their bodies, fierce and silent and swift, the creatures of the night matched against the creatures of the day. To rise into one of these orders was among the highest honours a man could earn, and the eagle and the jaguar together stood as the two faces of a warrior's courage, the daylight and the darkness, the sun above and the earth below. A lord who had risen through such deeds stood at last upon the terrace of the great temple in the finery his valour had earned, and he made a splendid sight, and it is worth picturing him, for he is the very image of that world at its proudest. Upon his head rose a towering crown of the long green plumes of the sacred mountain bird, shimmering and trembling with the least movement of the air, bound with bands of worked gold and set with discs of turquoise. A mantle of jaguar skin or of feathers hung from his shoulders. Gold gleamed at his ears and his lip and his wrists, and green stone lay cool against his breast. He carried a shield faced with a mosaic of feathers in a bright device, and he stood calm and unhurried, gazing out over the gleaming roofs and the bright water and the far snow mountains. A man who had climbed by his own courage from the schoolyard to the summit of his people's honour. That is the figure to hold in the mind, quiet and magnificent upon the high terrace in the golden light, when we think of what these people most admired. Yet for all the honour they gave to courage, they gave an honour nearly as great to skill, and the craftsmen of that world were prized and protected and gathered into their own honoured districts, and the finest of them served the lords and the temples directly. The most celebrated of all were the feather workers, the artists in plumage, who practised a craft so delicate and so peculiar to that world that no other land has ever quite matched it. They gathered the feathers brought as tribute from the hot forests, the shimmering green of the mountain bird, the turquoise and the scarlet, the yellow and the rose, and sorted them with infinite care. And then, feather by tiny feather, they laid them down upon a backing to build up pictures and patterns of astonishing beauty, gluing each barb in its place until whole scenes and emblems and the images of the gods glowed forth in colours no dye could equal, colours that shifted and burned as the light moved across them. A shield or a headdress or a cloak worked in this way was among the most precious things the world contained, fit for a king or a god, and the feather workers held their art as a sacred trust and taught it, generation to generation, as a treasure of the whole people. The workers in gold were scarcely less admired, though the people, it must be said, prized the metal less for its worth than for its beauty and its shine, valuing the green jade and the bright feathers above it. Still, the goldsmiths were masters, and they worked the soft bright metal by hammering it into thin sheets and by casting it in moulds through a clever method of wax and clay, making little figures and bells and beads and ornaments, birds whose feathers were separately worked, fish with movable scales, monkeys, flowers, tiny masterpieces of patient-making. There were workers in the green stone too, who drilled and ground and polished the hard jade into beads and figures and ear ornaments, labour of enormous patience, for the stone was hard, and their tools were only harder stone and sand and reed and water and time. There were the potters, and the weavers whose finest cloths of cotton and rabbit hair were worked with feather and dyed in patterns of great subtlety, and the scribes who painted the books, and the workers in wood and shell and turquoise mosaic, who covered masks and knife handles and shields with thousands of tiny cut stones set edge to edge into shimmering skins of blue and green. All these skills were honoured and taught and handed down, and the young were counselled to take pride in good and careful work, whatever their calling, whether they went out with the eagle and jaguar orders or stayed home at the loom and the mould. The elders had words for this too, spoken to the young of every trade, and a soft rendering of such counsel runs in this way: whatever the work your hands are given, do it well and do it fully. For the sloppy worker shames himself and cheats his people, but the one who labours with care becomes a face and a heart the gods look upon with favour. Take up your craft as the warrior takes up his shield, with a whole heart, and let no work leave your hands that you would be ashamed to set before a lord. So the makers were held to the same standard as the fighters, and courage in the field and care at the workbench were praised in the very same breath, as two ways of serving the same bright and demanding world. And there is something worth holding on to in that pairing, as we rest here among the eagles and the jaguars and the feather workers. For it shows a people who understood that a great civilization is built as much by the patient joining of tiny feathers into a shining picture as by the courage of men going out to war, and who honoured both, and who wove the fierce and the gentle together into one whole cloth. The warrior in his towering plumes upon the terrace, and the feather worker bent all day over his glowing work in a quiet room, were, to that world, two branches of a single tree, and both were needed, and both were praised. Let that balanced picture settle softly now, the bright courage and the patient skill, the plume and the shield and the glowing feathered image, as we turn at last toward the golden noon of the whole empire. Now the city stood at its noon, and it is worth lingering in that golden light. For the height of a civilization is a rare and a lovely thing, and it never knows, while it lasts, how brief it is going to be. Through the reigns of a line of able and ambitious kings, the empire had spread outward from the valley until it reached, in loose bands of tribute and alliance, from the edge of the northern deserts down to the hot forests of the far south, and from the shore of one sea across the mountains toward the shore of the other. An earlier king, remembered by the name Moctezuma, the elder of the two who bore that name, had carried the armies far and rebuilt the great temple grander than before. After him a warlike king named Ahuitzotl, whose name belonged to a fierce water creature of the marshes, pushed the borders farther still, down to the steaming southern lowlands, and brought back such floods of tribute that the city could scarcely hold it, and it was he who dedicated the great temple in its final and most towering form, and he who brought fresh water into the city through a new aqueduct, though the bringing of it once loosed a flood that taught even the mightiest lord his smallness before the water. And then came the last of the great kings before the ending, the second and more famous Moctezuma, who took the throne while the city was at the very summit of its wealth and power, and whose name the whole world would come to know. He was, by all the memory that reaches us, a proud and thoughtful and deeply religious man, a former priest and a brave soldier, learned in the calendar and the omens. Courteous and magnificent in his person, and under him the pomp of the court reached a height it had never known before. He drew the manners of the palace tight with ceremony, so that no common person might look upon his face or meet his eye, and where he walked, cloths were spread so that his feet should not touch the bare ground, and the greatest lords of the empire served him humbly at his table and in his chambers. To us this may seem cold, but to that world it was the proper awe owed to one who stood, they believed, nearest of all men to the gods, and the same king was known also for his care of the poor in time of famine, opening the storehouses of tribute to feed his people when the harvests failed. Let us walk, in imagination, through the city at this its brightest hour, for a traveller who came upon it then and lived to describe it could hardly believe that men had made it. From far off across the plain it appeared to float upon the shining water, its white towers and painted temples rising out of the lake, joined to the shore by the long straight causeways thronged with people coming and going. The smoke of 1,000 hearths and 100 temple fires drifting up into the clean high air, the 2 snow mountains standing guard beyond. Coming nearer along a causeway, broad and clean and crowded, a traveller passed over the wooden bridges above the flowing water, with canoes gliding beneath laden with flowers and maize, and entered a city of astonishing order, its streets and canals laid out straight, its houses swept and whitewashed. Its air, they said, sweeter than that of the crowded cities of far-off lands. For the people bathed daily and carried away their refuse, and would not foul the water they lived upon. At the centre rose the great precinct, and within it the towering twin temple, and around it the palaces of the king, which were less a single house than a small city of their own, hundreds of rooms about many courtyards, halls for the councils of state, and halls for the hearing of law, quarters for the countless servants and craftsmen and dancers and singers of the court, storehouses piled with the tribute of 100 lands, armories and rooms, whose walls and floors were of polished stone spread with fine mats, and hung with cloths of cotton and feather. There were gardens beyond counting, terraced and watered, full of flowers and healing herbs gathered from every region of the empire, with pools and fountains and shaded walks. There was a house of birds, a vast aviary where every kind of bird from every land the empire touched was kept and tended. The water birds upon their ponds, the birds of bright plumage in their great cages, fed and cared for by many keepers, so that a lord might walk among the living colour and song of his whole world gathered into one green place. There were pools of fish and enclosures of animals, the jaguar and the puma and the coyote and the serpent, and even, it is said, a place where those born unusual in body were cared for and kept. And there was the tribute, flowing in endlessly along the roads and heaping up in the storehouses, and it is in the lists of that tribute, dry as they might seem, that the reach and the richness of the empire can best be felt. From the hot lands came cacao by the load, and cotton, plain and dyed, woven into countless cloaks and lengths of cloth. From the forests came the feathers, bale upon bale of them, the green plumes of that revered bird above all, and the skins of jaguars, and rubber, and amber, and the beaks of bright birds. From the mines and the rivers came gold, in dust and in worked ornaments, and copper and turquoise and the green jade they loved. From the fields came maize and beans and chilies and dried fish and salt, and honey and paper made of bark, and every kind of food and fibre and fuel that the varied lands of the empire could yield, all of it counted and recorded in the painted books, and gathered into the city on the appointed days, so that the island upon the marsh, which had grown nothing of its own but what its floating gardens gave, was fed and clothed and adorned by the labour of 100 distant valleys. Consider, while we linger in this golden noon, the long roads themselves, and the two kinds of traveller who kept the far-flung realm knit together. There were, first, the great travelling merchants, a proud and secretive brotherhood who set out in long caravans of porters, for they had no carts and no pack beasts, and every burden went upon a man's back, braced by a strap across the brow. These merchants journeyed for months at a stretch into distant lands beyond the borders of the empire, to the hot coasts and the southern forests, carrying fine wares to trade, obsidian blades and worked cloaks and ornaments of copper, and returning with the treasures those far places yielded, jade and cacao and shimmering plumes. They travelled armed and watchful, ready to fight their road home, and they came to know the paths and the tongues and the secrets of every region they crossed, so that the rulers prized them not only as traders, but as gatherers of news, quiet eyes upon the rim of the world. They kept much to themselves, and dressed plainly even when they had grown rich, and a merchant who came back from a long and perilous journey with his caravan whole was honoured almost as a soldier was honoured, for he too had ventured far and returned. There were, second, the runners, the swift barefoot messengers who bore word along the roads faster than any single man could travel, sprinting in relays from post to post, each running his own stretch at full speed and passing the message onward to the next, so that news and orders flew across the whole breadth of the realm in a day or two, where a walking man would have needed weeks. It is remembered that fish, taken from the cool water of the distant coast at first light, could be carried by these relay runners up over the mountains and set before the king in his highland palace while it was still fresh, a small marvel that tells much about the speed and the discipline of the roads. Along those same roads went the armies and the pilgrims and the laden porters, and rest-houses stood at intervals to shelter them, and the whole vast web of tracks and causeways and mountain trails bound the 100 peoples of the empire to their shining capital, carrying its power outward and its riches inward in an endless patient traffic of burdened backs and running feet. Yet with all this power the wisest among them never forgot the older teaching, that greatness is lent and not owned, and that a ruler is a servant and a bearer of burdens and not a god. When a new king was raised up, the counsellors would speak to him words grave and humbling, of which a soft rendering runs thus: Lord, the burden is set now upon your back, the carrying frame and the tump-line of your people. You are the mother and the father of the nation now, the shade of its tree, the shelter of its wings. Rule not for yourself, but for the people. Remember that you too are mortal, that this throne is only lent to you for a brief spell, that others sat here before you and are gone, and that you also will lay it down. Be gentle to the poor, be just to all, and do not let this high seat make your heart proud, for pride has thrown down greater lords than you. So even at the summit of their power, the people reminded their kings of the shortness and the smallness of all human greatness. And the same thought that ran through the songs of the poet ran through the councils of the throne, that we remain here for no more than a season, and should bear our burdens gently. Picture it all, then, held in the still golden light of its noon. The shining island city at the middle of a world, the tribute carried in along the roads, the great market murmuring, the temples smoking, the aviaries full of song, the gardens full of flowers, the causeways crowded, the snow mountains standing white and calm beyond, and the proud, courteous, sorrowful king walking upon spread cloths through his 100 rooms, mindful even in his splendour that all of it was lent. It was as fair and as ordered and as mighty a thing as human hands had raised anywhere upon the earth in that age, the fruit of the patience of many generations, the fulfilment beyond all measure of the promise made beside the cactus in the reeds, and it stood at its very height, gleaming, complete, unaware, in the last calm years before the strangers came. Rest here, in the golden noon of the city, and hold its beauty gently in your mind. For the light is about to lengthen, very softly, into evening. Every golden noon must lengthen at last toward evening, and so it was for the shining lake capital, and we will tell of that evening as the people themselves would have wished it told, softly and with dignity, and without dwelling upon the sorrow of it, as one draws a gentle cloth over something precious that has been broken. For the ending, when it came from a direction no one had watched, out of the eastern sea, and it came in the reign of the second Moctezuma, at the very summit of the city's greatness, which is how such endings so often arrive, when all seems most secure. In the years before it, the memory tells us, there were signs and omens that troubled the king and his wise men, strange things in the sky and upon the water that they did not know how to read. A ribbon of fire was seen in the heavens at night, hanging over the valley for many evenings together. A temple caught flame without cause and could not be quenched. The lake was said to have risen up once without any wind. Birds were brought to the king bearing strange dark mirrors in their crowns in which he seemed to glimpse distant things. Whether all these wonders truly happened, or whether the later memory gathered them together and set them before the ending to make sense of it, no one can now say, but the people believed that their world had been warned, and that the king carried in those last years a heavy foreboding, a sense that the age of the fifth sun might be drawing toward its close, and that something long expected and long dreaded was coming toward them across the water. And then the strangers came. They came from beyond the eastern sea in great houses that floated upon the waves, pale-skinned and bearded men in shells of hard metal, bringing with them beasts no one in that world had ever seen, tall animals upon which a man could ride, and creatures that were like dogs but larger and fiercer, and instruments that spoke with fire and thunder. They were few at the first, a small band only, but they were unlike anything the world had known, and as they made their slow way up from the coast toward the valley they gathered to themselves the strength of nations within the empire that had long chafed under its tribute and its wars, so that what began as a handful of strangers became, in time, a great host of the discontented marching upon the city at the stranger's side. The king, uncertain whether these newcomers were men or gods, or the returning of an old god long ago departed toward the sunrise, received them with wary honour. He sent them gifts of gold and feathers and fine cloth, hoping perhaps to satisfy them and turn them back, though the gold, it is said, only drew them onward the faster, and at last he went out from his city to meet them upon the causeway in all his royal splendour, and welcomed the strangers into the city itself, and lodged them in a palace, and for a while the two worlds looked upon one another face to face within the shining city, the lords of the lake and the men from the sea, in a strange and brittle peace that could not hold. It did not hold. We will not trace the long and grievous unwinding of it step by step, for it is a sorrowful tale, and there is enough sorrow in the waking world without our carrying it into the quiet of the night. Let it be enough, and gently enough, to say that the brittle peace broke, that the king came to his death in the midst of the troubles, mourned by his people, that the strangers were for a time driven out of the city in a desperate and bitter night, and that they returned, strengthened by their many allies and by an unseen sickness that had crossed the sea with them, a sickness the folk of the valley had never known and could not withstand, and that emptied the houses more surely than any army. And so, after a long and painful siege, in which the men and women of the island defended their homes street by street and canal by canal, with a courage that even their enemies remembered afterward with awe, the shining, shining city was at last overcome, and its towers were thrown down, and the long age that had begun beside the cactus in the reeds came quietly, in smoke and silence, to its close. That whole nation made songs even of this, as they made songs of everything, and their laments for the ending are among the most moving that any people has ever left behind, for they do not rage, they grieve, softly and with a terrible tenderness, over the fall of the beautiful city. One such lament, rendered gently into our own speech, keeps a little of their sorrow. Broken spears lie along the roads, and the houses stand without their roofs, and their walls are stained red. The waters have turned bitter now, and the air hangs heavy with smoke. We have beaten our hands against the walls in our grief, for our inheritance, our city, is lost to us and dead. Weep, my people, and know that with this ending we have lost the nation upon the water. So they sang, remembering, and in the singing they laid their beautiful city gently to its rest. And yet, even here, at the darkest turning of the whole long story, we may find the gentleness that this night asks of us, for nothing that is truly loved is ever entirely lost. And the city did not so much perish as pass out of the daylight of the world and into the deeper keeping of memory and of legend. The lake would in time be drained away, and the causeways would become the streets of another city, and the tongue of the people would go on being spoken in the markets and the fields, and the flowers would go on blooming in the gardens, and the maize would go on rising green from the black earth, and the eagle upon its cactus would be carried forward through the generations, though those who carried it hardly knew from how deep a past it came. The golden city upon the bright water slipped, softly and without any further struggle for us to witness, out of the age of its living and into the long calm of its remembering, where it floats still, undimmed, for anyone who cares to picture it. So let the evening close over the city now, as gently as evening closes over the lake, the light going long and golden and then blue, the smoke settling, the water darkening, the two white mountains fading last of all into the dusk. Do not grieve too much for it had its noon, as bright as any that has ever shone upon the wide world, and it left its beauty in the memory of the world. And beauty, as the poet king sang, is only ever given to us for a time, and must one day be released, and is not the less precious for that, but the more. Rest now in the quiet after the ending, and once you have settled, we shall gather up what remained, and see how much of that lost world is living still. Let us gather up now, softly, the things that did not die when the city fell, for they are many, and they are all around us still, and there is great comfort in them. It is easy, when a great civilization comes to its ending, to imagine that everything it was simply vanished, swept clean away, as though it had never stood. But that is almost never how it truly goes. A world as deep and as rich as the world upon the lake does not vanish. It sinks down into the ground and into the blood and into the speech of those who come after, and it goes on living quietly beneath the surface of the new world that rises above it. And if you know how to look and how to listen, you may find it living yet. Consider first the tongue that the people spoke, the flowing Nahuatl speech in which the poet king made his songs and the elders murmured their counsels. It did not fall silent when the city fell. It is spoken still, this very night, by a great many people in the highland towns and villages of that land, mothers to children, neighbour to neighbour. The same soft sounds that once rang through the great market and the temple courts. And more than that, the old speech scattered its words like seeds into the speech of the whole wide world, so that people in far countries who have never heard of the city upon the lake use its words every day without knowing it. When they speak of the fruit of the cacao tree made into a sweet dark drink. When they name the small red and green fruit that grows upon the vine. When they name the sharp pods that give food its fire. When they speak of the strange animal that carries its young in a pouch, and of many another thing besides. The very things the people loved, their chocolate and their tomatoes and their chilies, went out from their gardens to feed and delight the entire earth, and carried the old words along with them, so that the lost world seasons the tables of nations that could not find its ruins upon a map. Consider, next, the food itself, for the floating gardens fed more than one city. The maize that the people raised upon their garden beds, the beans and the squash they grew beside it, the tomatoes and the chilies and the sweet fruits and the grain of the amaranth, all of these passed out of that world into the keeping of the whole human family, until today there is scarcely a country upon the earth whose cooking does not somewhere lean upon a gift that first came green from the black mud of the lake. When a child anywhere bites into a ripe tomato, or a sweet ear of corn, or tastes chocolate for the very first time, some small portion of that lost civilization is living again upon a living tongue, and its patient gardeners, poling their canoes through the dawn mist among the reeds, are quietly repaid. Consider the gardens themselves, for they too endured. Long after the towers came down, the dwellers of the drained valley went on tending garden plots at the water's edge in the old manor, dredging the rich mud, raising their narrow green fields above the channels, poling their flower-laden canoes to market through canals that were the last living remnant of the vanished lake, so that even in much later ages a traveller might glide among floating gardens bright with blossoms, and know that he was looking upon a thing far older than he supposed, a living memory of the reed beds of the city amid the reeds, kept green by the patient hands of the gardener's distant grandchildren. Consider the very ground on which the new world was raised, for when the strangers built their own great capital they did not carry it off to some fresh and empty site. They built it directly upon the bones of the old, in the same place, upon the same island in the drained bed of the same lake, so that the new city rose stone by stone out of the ruins of the old and stood exactly where it had stood. The great square at the heart of that later city was laid out upon the very precinct of the fallen temple, and for long centuries no one knew quite how much of the old world still lay sleeping beneath the paving, until in much later days, when workers digging beneath the modern streets struck the buried foundations of the great twin temple itself. The enormous carved stones came up again into the light after their long sleep in the earth, and the citizens of the modern city gathered to look upon the recovered heart of their most ancient mother, risen from beneath their own feet. The water-girt capital, it turned out, had never truly left. It had only been waiting, quietly, underground, and consider, last and dearest, the sign that began it all, the eagle above the cactus that the wandering priests saw in the sunrise so long ago. That sign was never let go. It was carried down through all the centuries, through the fall and the long ages after, and it lives today at the very centre of the flag of a great modern nation of many millions, an eagle perched upon a cactus that grows from a stone amid the waters, exactly as the god foretold and the priests beheld. Each day that flag is raised over that land, the ancient promise made to a poor and unwanted people beside a marsh is quietly renewed, and a whole nation carries forward, upon its highest emblem, the memory of the morning when its ancestors knew that they had come home. Few peoples in all the story of the earth have kept the token of their founding so faithfully, or worn it so proudly, across so wide a gulf of time. Those distant people, who loved to make songs of everything, would have understood all of this at once, for they always knew that nothing lasts, and yet that beauty is passed from hand to hand, that the flower fades, but the seed of it is given onward, that we are here only a small moment, and yet that our songs and our gardens and our children go on after us. And so it seems right to close this gathering up with one more of their flower songs, softly rendered, that seems to reach across the centuries directly to us, who are remembering them tonight. Will my songs still be sung when I am gone? Will the flowers I gathered still be held in other hands? I go away, but the song remains behind me. I go away, but the flower is given onward. Friends, let us take our joy in the flowers and the singing while we are here together, for we are only lent to one another, only for a small moment, and then we shall each of us go to the place of mystery, where all our separate roads at last become one. Let us be gentle then, while the light lasts. Let us gather flowers. So they sang long ago upon the shore of a lake that is gone, and their song has been given onward, from hand to hand across the centuries, all the way to this quiet room, tonight. So the world upon the lake did not vanish after all. It survives in the speech of highland villages, and in the words of every tongue on earth. It endures in the food upon the tables of nations. It goes on within the green garden plots and the flower-laden canoes. It lingers still in the buried temple beneath the modern square, and in the flag that flies above a great people, and in the songs that still say to us, gently, that we should love the fading flowers of our days. The city slipped out of the daylight, yes, but it slipped only into a deeper and a safer keeping, and it floats there still, golden upon its bright water beneath its snow-topped mountains, for anyone who cares, on a quiet night to close the eyes and picture it. Rest now in the comfort of all that endured, and let us, very gently, begin to make our way towards sleep. And so the entire story of the people upon the lake has now come, gently, to its close. It began, as you may remember from the very start of our long night together, with a single slender canoe of reeds, gliding without a sound across a wide and still lake at the first grey light of dawn, toward a city that seemed to rest upon the water itself. Let us return there now, one last time, and let that be the picture we carry down with us into sleep. See the lake again in the early morning, before anyone is stirring, its surface perfectly still and silver, the mist lying soft and low upon it, the two great snow mountains beginning to catch the first faint rose of the coming sun, the one with its thin plume of smoke drifting up into the pale sky. See the reeds standing motionless along the shore, and the water birds still folded and quiet, and the little canoe moving out from among the reeds, poled by a single unhurried figure, its wake spreading behind it in long slow rings across the glass of the water. And there, ahead, rising out of the lake in the growing light, the city, its pale towers and terraced temples and green garden beds gleaming gold as the sun lifts at last above the mountains, floating, shining, calm, exactly as it must have looked to those who loved it, on just such a morning, long ago. It is all gone now, of course, the canoe and the polar and the towers and the lake itself, gone down into the long past like everything that has ever lived and been beautiful upon the earth. And yet, as the poet king sang so softly across the centuries, that is not a thing to grieve over too hard in the quiet of the night, for the flowers are only ever placed in our keeping for a season, and must in time be given up, and are not the less lovely for that, but somehow the more. Civilizations rise in their appointed valleys and flower into their golden noons, and lengthen at last into evening and pass into memory, all of them, the greatest along with the least, within the larger and gentler rhythms of time, as the seasons turn, as the maize rises green and is gathered in, as the lake breathes its mist up each morning and lets it fall again. And still, always, somewhere, ordinary and undismayed, life goes quietly on. A mother grinds the maize and pats the cakes upon the griddle at the first light. A gardener poles his flower-laden canoe along a narrow channel to the market. A child bites into a sweet ripe fruit and laughs. A flag with an eagle and a cactus lifts in the morning wind above a living land. The city on the lake gave all of this onward, and it is with us still, and it is enough. So let the picture of that shining city on its bright and quiet lake settle now over your own quiet resting place, and let it grow soft and dim and far away. Take a slow breath in, gently, and let it go slower still. Feel the soft weight of the covers resting over you, and the pillow beneath your head, and let the gentle hum of the fan blend with the darkness of the room until the two are one soft, steady sound. Let your shoulders loosen, and your hands unfold, and let the whole small weight of the day drift down and away from you, out across the still water, out toward the fading golden towers, out of your keeping altogether for tonight. There is nothing at all left for you to do now, nothing to carry, nothing to hold. The story is told, and the city is safe in its long remembering, and you may let go and rest. Good night, dear listener. Good night from quiet centuries, where histories are told softly for the longest nights. May the slow, soft drift of these centuries carry you gently down toward the morning. Sleep well, and sleep deep, and let the quiet current of the past bear you kindly on into peaceful dreams. Good night.